For decades, the film and music industries were the two biggest forces in American media. And as such, the prospect of using both industries to make money off the same property had been a long-time draw to many producers in both industries. It's why Elvis starred in so many films, despite their quality, why the Rat Pack got to make Ocean's 11, and why movie stars got their own albums. But for the longest time, that was just how it was. One artist would move on to the other industry the minute they were established in the other. It was a crossover from one after the other. But producers started to wonder, what if someone could use both at the same time to promote the other? What if an artist was so present in both that it became hard to separate them into either category? In 1966 and 1967, the Monkees were the biggest American band. In both those years, they outsold the Beatles while having one of the most successful TV shows on air. They were on top of the world. And then by the end of 1967, it was all over. The band had put out 4 albums, topped the singles chart 3 times, won 2 Emmys, and in less than 2 years since their show started, it was cancelled. And then things got weird. Let's talk about that.
Close your eyes.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!
It's hard to describe just how important the Beatles were to pop and rock music in the 60s. There is very little about 60s popular music that wasn't in a way influenced by the rise of the Beatles. And many bands owe their entire formation to them, and I'm not sure there's a single band that owes more to them than the Monkees. The story of the Monkees begins with 2 young film producers, Bert Schneider and Bob Rafelson. Both are looking for a foot in the door when in 1964 they saw a film called A Hard Day's Night. The story goes they saw the film and wondered if instead of a movie supporting an already popular band, a TV show could create and popularize a band, and that band could exist on its own. The idea being that because they were on TV every week, they'd remain in the public consciousness, and they could promote singles on the show and cycle new ones in and out whenever one started to drop. By April 1965, they had sold the show idea to Screen Gems. Thus began the mad race to get the 4 boys to play these characters. An ad was put out in the Hollywood Reporter and Daily Variety that said,
Madness! Folk and roll musicians, singers wanted for acting roles in new TV show. Hearts for 4 insane boys!
Ah yes, for this job, only 4 insane boys will suffice. They started with 400, whittled it down to 14, and then eventually got their 4 insane boys. Those 4 being former child actor and son of George Dolenz, Mickey Dolenz, who at the time was fronting his own band, Mickey and the One-Nighters. While they were a small group, Dolenz was considered a talented singer, and he even started writing his own material, though it wasn't his main passion for sure. Then came Michael Nesmith, son of the inventor of liquid paper. Wait, what? who after serving in the Air Force was gifted a guitar and became a talented songwriter and eventually became a solo musician with a few singles. Though they weren't successful, he was definitely one of the more accomplished musicians screened. Next was Peter Tork, often considered to be the most musically talented of the group. He was an accomplished multi-instrumentalist, an important part of the Greenwich Village folk scene, and was actually referred onto the Monkees project by his friend, Stephen Stills. Yes, Crosby, Stills, and Nash Stephen Stills. This band is fucking wild! And then there was Davy Jones. He's sort of the wild card of the group. Not that he wasn't accomplished, in fact he was, but not as a rock musician. Davy's gig right before the Monkees was actually quite a big deal. He was actually the Artful Dodger in the original London performances of Oliver, even being nominated for a Tony in the process. But when he performed that role on the Ed Sullivan Show the same night the Beatles tore the roof off the place, he knew where he wanted to be.
Davy Jones was certainly an actor in face first, musician very much second. In fact, as can be seen in most performances when Davy isn't the singer of a song, he's playing the tambourine. A seemingly inaudible tambourine.
Now I must hang up the phone. Now I must hang up the phone.
That isn't to discount Davy, he was a solid singer. But looking back, it was clear that he had the least on his resume when it came to music. That's not a bad thing, that's not a good thing, it just is. Also, this isn't completely relevant, but I wanted to bring it up because when else am I going to be able to talk about this? There was another English musician around the same time, also named Davy Jones, who decided to change his name to not be confused with the Monkees member. He decided to choose a stage name. A stage name that was David Bowie. Wonder if that guy did anything.
Regardless, the band was now formed, though it soon became clear the word band was sort of a misnomer. When it came to the music for the show, the band didn't have much input. That was mostly the jobs of music supervisor Don Kirshner and songwriters Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart. The recording process would be that the band would record their parts separately so they wouldn't goof off in the studio, and then they'd bring in session musicians to perform the songs instead, where they'd lay the band's vocals over them. Eventually, they would have enough for their first album, the soundtrack for a lot of the first season, which led to the release of the band's first single, Last Train to Clarksville.
Released just barely a few weeks before the show started, it shot straight up the charts to #1, and it became clear that their plan was probably going to work out. Before their show had even aired, Monkees Mania had begun. The show premiered on September 12, 1966 on NBC and was an instant hit among audiences, gaining them tons of young fans.
The show was made up of each of the Monkees playing themselves, each having a certain quirk to them. Davy was the lover boy who became attached to every girl he met. Mike was the smart, cunning one who came up with the ideas. Mickey was the wacky wild card, always wanting to go nuts. And Peter was the lovable oddball who didn't seem to keep up with things going on around him.
If you're familiar with the lore, is that right? The lore of the Beatles, you'd notice that those are literally the exact character types they'd be portrayed as in their movies and their lesser known cartoon. Davy was Paul, Mike was George, Mickey was John, and Peter was Ringo. I guess they figured don't fuck with the formula, but it does make it all feel a bit carbon copied. Oh, and warning, this is not the last time the Beatles will come up in this story. Trust me about that.
The series mostly consisted of the band getting into hijinks and adventures as they struggled to make it as a band. They would solve mysteries, save princesses, thwart spies, be kidnapped. Really any wacky adventure they thought would work easily in a lighthearted 60s sitcom format.
As you might expect, it's not exactly my thing. In fact, I honestly got tired of watching it after a while and only continued for this video. It's not that the show is bad, it's just so obviously family-oriented, formulaic, and edgeless like, well, most 60s television. It was maybe more out there for its time when it came to sitcoms, and I can definitely see that in a way, but honestly, we've evolved so far past this by this point. I mean, even the jump from this to, say, The Mary Tyler Moore Show just 3 years later is staggering in terms of the change in maturity. We're just kind of past wacky adventures in 2021, and while I don't blame anyone for enjoying this, it feels kind of basic for me as someone who didn't grow up on it.
Even the band got sick of the formula after a while. Mickey Dolenz stated in his autobiography,
Quite frankly, we were getting a little jaded with the show as it existed. Every week, Davey would fall in love with some girl, or Peter would be kidnapped by some bad guy, or some guy spy would hide microfilm in somebody's something or other.
I'd had to admit there was also a weirdly large amount of cross-dressing, which I get was a common comedic trope in the 60s, but like...
If I have to go out to dinner dressed as a girl, I'd rather stay home.
Pardon me, madam?
I never speak to strangers. Oh, my husband's insanely jealous. Come on.
Wow, there's some gender going on there.
the first season isn't exactly boundary breaking by modern standards, despite their appearances as 4 insane boys on the show. They were safe for kids. They were fun for the whole family. And while that may hurt the show's longevity today, at the time it helped them sell millions of records.
A little over a month into the show premiering, the first Monkees album dropped, and it immediately went to #1, staying there for 13 weeks straight. It even outsold the Beatles' Revolver, making it the highest-selling album in America. Except for Herb Alpert's Whipped Cream. Yeah, I don't know how that happened, but we're just gonna roll with it, okay?
The album was a success, but the Monkees were not happy. When Mickey Dolenz, for example, first saw the album, he was shocked at the packaging.
The first album shows up and I look at it with horror because it makes us appear as if we are a rock and roll band. There's no credit for the other musicians. I go completely ballistic and say, what are you people thinking? The powers that be say, well, you know, it's the fantasy. And I say, it's not the fantasy. You've crossed the line here. You are now duping the public. They know when they look at the television series that we're not a rock and roll band. It's a show about a rock and roll band. It's witty and wacky, and nobody for a minute believes that we are this somehow accomplished rock and roll band that got their own television show. It's absurd, and you putting this record out like this is just beyond the pale.
It's debatable how much the public was really duped by this. We'll never really know how many people actually believe they were a real band. But the common tale is that lying about them being a real band was maybe not the best idea for long-term success.
It didn't help that Mike Nesmith and Peter Tork, being the most musically talented of the group, hated the music they were making.
I didn't have any ambivalence about how the music was being made. I hated it. Pure and simple.
I was a wreck. I was fit to be tied because of the music. And I liked Last Train to Clarksville, and I loved the way David sang. But the rest of it was just hopeless junk.
It was bubblegum pop, cleaned up and safe for all audiences, with very little passion behind it. Sure, personally, I'd argue it has more value than that may imply, but it didn't matter to them. It wasn't theirs. To the crew, and especially Kirshner, this was a job first. They had to make money, and the rest of the band was tired of being told they had no impact.
It wasn't that the Monkees didn't play their own instruments. The Monkees were not allowed to play their own instruments. If we'd have had a choice in the matter, it would have only been the four of us right from the get-go.
One of the few chances they got to actually perform was when they were forced to go on tour while the show was still airing. They had some energy, some spunk, and barely sounded anything like they did on the album, but they were having fun, and for once really felt like a band. And then mid-tour, their next album came out, with none of their knowledge or direct involvement.
And the Monkees were still on tour when they discovered that their second album had already been released.
Somebody goes across the street to the mall and brings us back the album. It's the first we've seen it. And there we are in JCPenney clothes on the cover.
Well, that's when Mike Nesmith and Peter Tork went crazy.
They were pissed off and felt like they were majorly fucked over. Here they were, out performing, being the face of everything, and they didn't even get a say in the album?
And yet, angry as they might be, the album immediately shot to #1, outsold their first, and actually became the highest selling record in America in 1967.
But the damage was done. Their relationship with Don Kirshner was completely ruined, and the band wanted him gone. And Rafelson and Schneider agreed. Kirshner was fired shortly afterwards, and the Monkees were allowed to make their own album by themselves.
Working with the Turtles' bassist Chip Douglas, the band banged out Headquarters, their first album made entirely by them on their own terms.
And I view that as an achievement in a way. They had to fight for real independence, and as a result, they maybe made their best record to date in that moment. It immediately shot to #1, and it felt like the Monkees had truly done it. They had cut the strings and still succeeded. They were finally a real band. Then a week later, this happened. Told you they'd be back.
A week later, they were knocked off the top of the charts by the wrecking ball that was Sgt. Pepper. More people may have bought the second Monkees album earlier that year, meaning they'd technically still outsell the Beatles again, but you didn't need to buy Sgt. Pepper. It was a movement. They played it on radio stations front to back for days. People held listening parties. It was selling way more copies internationally than the Monkees ever did. It was the biggest event in music. And it was so not the Monkees. By this point, the band was mostly found out as phonies, and their latest record really didn't cool things down, even if they had made it themselves. And it didn't help that that very Beatles album basically killed their entire momentum by completely shifting the entire landscape of the 60s.
Before 1967, there were protests, there was civil unrest, but mostly it was the beatniks or the poets. The 60s we think of that became widespread the minute Sgt. Pepper dropped, that is when flower power and hippies became a subculture, and the summer of love began.
Think about how much changed at this point, really. Just a year before, the Monkees were considered cool. But in 1967, two of the biggest hits were the Doors' Light My Fire and Strawberry Alarm Clock's Incense and Peppermints, while bands like the Jimi Hendrix Experience, Cream, and Jefferson Airplane had massively successful debut albums. Even the British invasion bands the Monkees were supposed to be copying had quickly moved on. We already know the Beatles were pushing the boundaries of pop music, but at the same time, the Rolling Stones were getting bluesier, Who were about to get headier, and the Kinks had gone full Baroque. To quote Mike Nesmith in the liner notes of the re-release of their next album,
"Everybody in the press and in the hippie movement had got us into their target window as being illegitimate and not worthy of consideration as a musical force or certainly any kind of cultural force. We were under siege. Wherever we went, there was such resentment for us. We were constantly mocked and humiliated by the press. We were really getting beat up pretty good."
Even if it was time for one more season, in retrospect, they were slowly becoming a relic of the past. But the band and producers didn't know that quite yet. They just won an Emmy and they were going to their second season and they were ready to evolve and change.
So I get the idea the band weren't the only people upset with the formula. Rafelson and Schneider originally envisioned the series as influenced by the French New Wave, experimental with new forms of communication involved. And it's clear to me at least that wasn't what was allowed to happen in the first season. In the new season, however, fourth wall breaks became a commonplace fixture.
Now then, here, Kenny, yeah. For all practical purposes, you see, the show is over, but we have in the television industry what they call a tag. which is some sort of just complete laugh riot at the end of a show, so that you all will tune back in next week, you see, because it's so hilarious.
Psychedelia, hippie culture, drugs, and the war became alluded to. Plotlines became much more surreal and odd than the first season where they were just straight cartoony. The show became cooler and more authentic than it ever had been, shedding its manufactured skin.
As much as I'd argue the series still isn't as great as later television would be and is held back by its era, there is a genuine bonkers energy to it all. And it feels more genuine than anything in the first season did.
And the band even had one final #1 hit up their sleeve with the chart-topping hit Daydream Believer, which became so iconic that decades later it even appeared in the game Wii Music.
Oh, in that case, I'll take 20 copies.
But honestly, they could have released the most successful single of all time and it wouldn't have been enough. It was over.
Their ratings plummeted that season. The damage was done by their prior image. They weren't hip enough for the audience they had targeted, and families had other more established options to go to once the show became less for them and more for the band themselves.
I mean, most families are probably thinking, why watch the Monkees when we could just watch the Andy Griffith Show? Oh, that's the wrong clip.
By 1968, both NBC and the producers had agreed the show had run its course. While the band and producers had been wondering about a complete retooling for season 3, they didn't fight when NBC brought up cancellation as an option. The show was over, but they at least had a chance to make the final episodes on their own. And it gets weird.
The show had been getting progressively more out there as time had gone on, with the second to last episode including Mike Nesmith interviewing his friend and avant-garde icon Frank Zappa in an utterly bizarre interview where they pretend to be each other. But it's the finale that truly showed the direction they were going. The finale, written by Mick himself, is about an evil wizard from space.
That wizard came from the moon.
You know, space, the place wizards come from. Don't know what's confusing about that.
Who hypnotizes people through their television, converting them into mindless drones.
Gee, I wonder what he's trying to say.
Essentially, this is how they had come to view their role in pop culture, as dumbing down the American public while real shit happened around them. A destructive force killing the populace's mind. Anyway, the story ends with them incapacitating the wizard using a mellowing gas produced by a strange plant.
I didn't realize it was possible to take Sully out back and shoot it.
And then to end off the episode, we do not end with a final song by the Monkees, but a song by a then unknown folk artist and friend of Mickey Dolenz, Tim Buckley. Yes, 70s indie folk legend Tim Buckley. I've just learned to stop questioning things at this point.
And with that, the Monkees' reign on TV was over after only 2 seasons. While the Beatles became the first rock band to ever win Best Album at the Grammys, the Monkees' biggest presence on TV was dead. Feel bad for them? Well, this wasn't exactly the end for them exactly. See, the Monkees still had one final message for the world. A final attempt to take hold of the public. And it is by far my favorite moment of their career. At the meeting was the band, Schneider, Rafelson, and a friend of Rafelson, whose name I'm forgetting. Man, if only he could introduce himself in an over-the-top way.
Here's Johnny!
Like that.
Yes, Jack Nicholson. The Jack Nicholson. Well, okay, he wasn't the Jack Nicholson yet. In the 60s, Jack Nicholson hadn't really become a star yet. He was just an up-and-coming actor friends with Rafelson. But he was instrumental to the making of this film and how it came out the way it did.
So at the meeting, they set up a tape recorder, smoked some weed, and started tossing around ideas for what they wanted to do in the film. Eventually, Nicholson and Rafelson would craft this into a screenplay, and production went ahead on Head. Fun fact, there isn't really a reason this film is called Head. It's not like an important thing in the storyline. It was really just called that so if there was a sequel, they could put on the poster, "From the people who gave you Head." Mature.
Weird name aside, in a lot of ways the shoot sort of marked the end of the collaboration between the Monkees and the producers on this film. See, despite the band themselves crafting many of the ideas that would become the basis of Head, they weren't credited as writers at all. And as a result, the band protested by not showing up to day one of the shoot. Meanwhile, the producers, maybe not getting the reason why the Monkees were mad, took it as a slight against the idea of them. So throughout the entire filming, there was clashing of personalities, and the Monkees, despite generally being involved in the formation of this movie, mostly referred to it as a Rafelson and Nicholson project as a result.
But finally the movie was done, and we get to talk about it. So how was it? Spoilers ahead, obviously.
The film is by far the most experimental project the Monkees had ever taken part in, even more bizarre than their finale. A surrealist film without much of an overlying plot. The Monkees walk through several genres, storylines, and tropes, abandoning all of them as it falls apart and they get sick of them. The best example of it being this moment.
Oh, I don't want to do this anymore, man. Oh, these fake arrows and this junk and the fake trees. Bob, I'm through. Oh, thanks, man.
Hey, well, Mickey, wait a minute. Well, Mickey, wait a minute, man. I'm with you. Wait, hold on.
In a way, this film is completely directionless in its story and structure, just a blind stumbling mess. But I like to think that has its merit and a point.
Okay, stay with me here. They are essentially walking through manufactured media worlds, similar to the ones they presented on TV. They attempt to tell stories, all of them which are seemingly based on plot lines seen commonly in movies and TV, only for them to fall apart, either with them walking off and becoming bored, or with the whole scene devolving into chaos. But continually, they get shoved back into these stories, seemingly by force.
Are you getting what the point might be now?
The thesis statement of the movie is actually described nicely by a song in the film itself. The first song the film plays after its theme, the Diddy Diego War Chant.
A song I can't play because, even though I'm reviewing it, YouTube is much harsher on copyrighted music than anything else, particularly music by very popular bands like the Monkees. So instead, here's a performative reading of the lyrics to the Diddy Diego War Chant.
Hey, hey, we are the Monkees, you know we love to please. A manufactured image with no philosophies. We hope you like our story, although there isn't one. That is to say, there's many. That way there is more fun.
I just want to pause to remind you all that this is the same band that sang I'm a Believer for a second. Okay, let's continue.
You told us you like action and games of many kinds. You like to dance, we like to sing, so let's all lose our minds. We know it doesn't matter, cause what you came to see is what we'd love to give you, and give it 1, 2, 3. But it may come 3, 2, 1, 2, or jump from 9 to 5. And when you see the end in sight, the beginning may arrive. For those who look for meanings and form as they do fact, we might tell you one thing, but we'd only take it back. Not back like in a box back, not back like in a race, not back so we can keep it, but back in time and space. You say we're manufactured, to that we all agree. So make your choice, and we'll rejoice in never being free. Hey, hey, we are the Monkees. We've said it all before. The money's in, we're made of tin. We're here to give you...
And just as it reaches that ending point, the film plays it. A brutal execution that I will obviously not play for various reasons.
But it isn't just a random clip for shock value. Specifically, it's maybe one of the most famous executions ever. One that I guarantee you know of. The shot to the head that killed Nguyen Van Lem. Done cruelly and inhumanely by a South Vietnamese soldier. A war crime on film.
It served as a reminder of what the Monkees were distracting from with their TV antics, the horrors of the world they were helping pacify, as put by the movie having them then dress up as cheerleaders and, well, cheer for war.
Give me a door! What does it spell?
Similarly, when performing, they are shown as religious figures, praised and cheered for, wearing all white clothing, even bowing down to themselves as if they were messiahs. They are false prophets. They are distractions. They are liars. And it's clear they're tired of being that.
Think about what was going on while their show was on the air. It premiered only 2 years after the assassination of JFK. The Vietnam War was raging. And in fact, it was only getting worse day by day. And what were people watching? A bunch of silly boys having a goof on TV. They hated what they represented, and they wanted to destroy it.
As time goes on, the film seems to lose whatever structure was left. The film becomes completely dreamlike, and in fact, at one point, literally entering a dream. Occasionally they enter back into a scene only for it to fall apart in less than 30 seconds. It's like they're running away, tired of being forced to sacrifice themselves to roles that aren't themselves. But they can't run forever.
Throughout the film, there are several figures pushing them into these plot lines, but when they keep being able to escape, these figures seem to get fed up. And that's where the box comes in.
The box, as it's often referred to, is a black room the band routinely gets locked into towards the end of the movie. The band finds it suffocating, imprisoning, and yet they have no control. They attempt to rebel. They walk through every scene from earlier in the movie with no regard to maintaining the storyline. They blow away the studio heavy that has been a foil up to this point, until they're placed right back in the box by an even larger, more powerful producer, literally the size of a giant, representing the sizable power executives have over them. They attempt one final time to run from the producer, who has weaponized every character against the Monkees, only to end up where the film started, a grand opening of a bridge, the Monkees interrupting it with their fling of every other character in the film, and making the fateful decision to jump.
They jump, just to avoid their fate. They could live and swim away, or they could fall to their death. But no matter what, they'll at least be free. Except that isn't how it works.
It looks good, they're swimming freely in psychedelia, only for it to end like this.
They can't escape the box they've been put in, no matter how hard they try. Even an attempt at death and their image is still at the mercy of a studio producer. As stated by Pete earlier in the movie,
Don't you see, David? It doesn't matter whether we're in the box or not.
It doesn't matter because they can't be separated from their characters anymore. This is who the public will always see them as. Even when they're outside the box, they have no choices.
I'm so incredibly blown away by the way this film meditates on the concept of choice when your image is out of your control. It truly is one of the first films to explore that aspect of celebrity culture. Obviously there's the box imagery, how we place celebrities into boxes, but even then there's an entire scene where they discuss the concept of choice and existence with a Swami, which I admit is kind of a racist trope. While only Peter understands, the way he explains it is fascinating. They have no choice anyway. The Monkees can no longer exist as a creative entity, and any attempts to challenge that box will go ignored by those that put them there, and be reviled by those that love them. That it's best to just let it happen. That no matter what happened, they'd be stuck where they are, and to enjoy it while it lasts. The film showing references to the Monkees show shows that too. When Mickey becomes the butt of a joke, Peter has to interrupt. It's his role to play.
Stay down, dummy!
You're the dummy.
No, he's the dummy.
You're the dummy.
No, he's the dummy.
You are the dummy. Dummy.
No, he's the dummy. I'm not the dummy. Stay down, dummy.
Mickey. I'm the dummy, Mickey. I'm always the dummy.
You're right, Pete. You're always the dummy. I forgot. I'm sorry. You're always the dummy, Pete.
The film's mocking of the manufactured reality of film is also incredibly unique, particularly for the time. While there are exceptions, it's hard to think of an American film made beforehand that truly broke the concept of storytelling this much. I mean, I guess there was the sadly underseen Hell's a Poppin', but that one is way less angry than this one is, and is much more whimsical with how it breaks the fourth wall. I think the film I'd actually compare this to is the Czech New Wave classic Daisies. Daisies is similarly a plotless series of sketches where the characters move in and out of reality and cause chaos, and both do so with purpose. With Daisies, it's critique of bourgeoisie, decadence, and restrictive systems of rules, and for Head, it was open contempt for the very concept of manufactured reality by Hollywood. And frankly, I think Head has earned its place in history for that. I mean, Daisies, while obscure, has become known in certain film buff circles as an enduring classic. I think Head deserves to be recognized in the same way. Honestly, I think this film was fantastic. It's a weird trip down the unreality of media, the false images constructed by said media, and the desire the Monkees had to escape that and do whatever they wanted for once. The filmmaking is more experimental than the show ever got, and the music, while not of any consistent style, is my personal favorite in their discography. It may be hard to follow for some, and if you aren't into connecting the dots, it won't be fun at all. But I personally think it's the most inspired part of the band's entire career, and yet predictably, it failed. I don't see a single way it couldn't have failed. As the movie explained, the band was trapped in a box, and that box had suddenly become incredibly uncool by late 1968. And by attempting to be boundary pushing instead, they just alienated their primary audience of children. The film has an assassination in it, for Christ's sake. What were kids going to find in it? That is, if anyone was really interested in a Monkees movie anyway. As I said, they were pretty passé at this point, and their show wasn't even doing well, and that was much more accessible to the average family. Even if they had attempted to make a more typical film, I don't think anything would have gotten them that huge hit, let alone kept their careers alive. And with that, the Monkees movie career was over. A beautiful end in my opinion, but an end nonetheless. After the film bombed, the band and the producers went their separate ways. The band released 3 more albums, with the band slowly bleeding members, with Torque leaving in 1968 and Nesmith in 1970. By the end of 1970, Dolenz and Jones, the final remaining members, called it quits. The band was over. For now, at least. Meanwhile, Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider were preparing to work in film once again. And that, to me, is the more fascinating part of this story. Everyone likes to make stories about the Monkees themselves and their careers afterward. But Rafelson and Schneider, the men who created the Monkees, arguably had the better careers. And you could tell something was coming in a way by looking at the talent of both old faces and up-and-coming stars they got to buy into Head. Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider were pretty incredible at finding talent. I already mentioned Jack Nicholson, but you'd be surprised who else they got for Head. Some past and future stars include Vito Scotti, Victor Mature, Terry Garr, and Timothy Caron. Not to mention some surprising ones, like former heavyweight boxing champion Sonny Liston, future one-hit wonder and legend among choreographers Tony Basil, and Frank Zappa, who, as we already mentioned, had already appeared on the TV show. And fun fact, The man whose head was used as a promotional image for the film was John Brockman, who would later go on to become a powerful literary agent and allegedly aided Jeffrey Epstein.
That fact wasn't fun at all!
But the real star of the show was an unknown actor named Dennis Hopper, who made a short cameo as an extra in Head.
This was the first example of Rafelson and Schneider's Raybert Productions worked with Dennis Hopper, but it wouldn't be the last. You see, they, along with Jack Nicholson, would all come together to make their next project, and you'll never guess what that was.
I gotta go. What even is this story?
Rafelson and Schneider, after years of constructing a manufactured band with a family-friendly exterior, pitched in to help finance and produce one of the most important American films ever made. Financing and producing done with the money they made from the Monkees and with filmmaking experience from Head. In other words, without the Monkees and Head, there is no Easy Rider.
I don't think I need to talk too much about Easy Rider, or at least I hope not. It's a classic, a fantastic piece of cinema, and one of the first big indie hits in Hollywood history, taking relative unknowns with an extremely different filmmaking style to what was popular and making them hits. Alongside movies like The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, and Midnight Cowboy, Easy Rider is commonly cited as a huge influence on the boom of gritty, more realistic filmmaking of the 70s, which led to your Godfathers, your Taxi Drivers, your Woman Under the Influences, and of course, your Star Warses. The inclusion of hard drugs, lots of cursing, pop songs, and commentaries on modern societal movements and feelings in society really resonated with people. It was a look at an America where citizens were left behind, and in a way that drew people in. They'd never seen the flaws of our country and our society so plainly illustrated in an American film, and that made it special.
So special that Raybert, or BBS as they had recently changed their name, had an incredible hit on their hands with no compromising of their creative vision. So they went full in on the next one, Rafelson's directorial follow-up to Head, 5 Easy Pieces.
While it's obviously not as iconic as Easy Rider, 5 Easy Pieces was also a massive success, and is still beloved to this day. And it even got something Easy Rider didn't, a nomination for Best Picture. With this film, Rafelson was praised as a new American auteur, just like the French New Wave directors he admired, and the film established Jack Nicholson as a leading man, something that worked out pretty well for him.
It's really unbelievable the run BBS went on since Head came out. It truly was one of the most prolific studios in film history. But the best way to summarize it is that its run was so notable and mind-blowingly good that it has its own Criterion box set. That box set includes not only Easy Rider and 5 Easy Pieces, but other BBS hits like The Last Picture Show. Rafelson's third featured The King of Marvin Gardens, 2 other Jack Nicholson vehicles, and Head.
Yeah, apparently I'm not the only one to find this weird drug movie to be so appealing. Despite the mixed to bad reception when it came out, it has actually become a cult classic for so many people, with screenings of the film happening across the United States. Maybe not widespread, but it's a film that, if you know about it, you probably know someone who is passionate about it. And yeah, it's technically in the Criterion Collection. If only the band's reaction to it was just as warm.
For years, the band had trouble even acknowledging that the movie existed. Michael Nesmith and Peter Tork called it a sabotage, a murder back at the beginning of the 2000s that Schneider and Rafelson knew it would bomb and were trying to kill the Monkees from the start.
Nesmith at least seemed to have a change of heart on the film eventually, as in a 2012 interview with Rolling Stone, he said,
"By the time Head came out, the Monkees were a pariah. There was no confusion about this. We were on the cosign of the line of approbation, from acceptance to rejection, and it was over. Head was a swan song. We wrote it with Jack and Bob, and we liked it. It was an authentic representation of a phenomenon we were a part of that was winding down. It was very far from suicide, even though it may have looked like that. There were some people in power, and not a few critics, who thought there was another decision that could have been made. But I believe the movie was an inevitability. There was no other movie to be made that would not have been ghastly under the circumstances.
For the record, though, Jack Nicholson has always stood by the film, saying, I saw it like 158 million times, man. I loved it. That was the most stereotypically Jack Nicholson way of putting that.
As for the band themselves, they all tried solo careers, Nesmith's being the most successful as he had both minor hits with his band and by himself. But eventually there were several reunions trying to recapture the magic to varying degrees. That is until something happened.
See, Michael Nesmith helped pioneer an early show that helped present these early artistic pieces that paired music and video, and sold that idea to a group of investors who turned that into I'm not even surprised at this point.
See, while MTV was a massive success and changed how we viewed music as a medium, it is important to note that it didn't have much behind music videos for a long time. Original programs like Daria and Real World were over a decade away, so to fill slots in between their music video blocks, they decided to help syndicate the Monkees, helping to expose them to a younger audience. This was by far the most successful the band had been in years. There were reunion tours, a new album, a top 20 hit, and reconvening friendships. The band that seemingly saw their final public image as a murder were now back. Rifleson was still making movies too. It's honestly kind of a happy end to the story.
Sadly, since then, Peter Tork and Davy Jones have passed away. But Nesmith and Dolenz do carry on the spirit of the band today. And their songs, while considered cheesy then, have aged a lot better than I think anyone thought they would. You can't deny bop. Just gonna put that out there. If a song's a bop, it doesn't matter how fake it is, it's a bop. Hell, the band seems to have a sense of humor about their place in pop culture too.
Excuse me, can you tell me where the bananas are?
Who are you, some kind of monkey?
Actually, I am.
I know. He's is one of the monkeys from the show Monkees.
And I mean, weren't they influential in a weird way?
I mean, think about it. MTV marketed stars based purely on looks and mixed the mediums of television and music. Boy bands and Max Martin pop of the late 90s were clearly manufactured, but we didn't care. Disney regularly tries to promote their stars by putting them in both television and releasing their albums. And we literally watched One Direction be formed by Simon Cowell on The X Factor and knew they weren't really a band that formed naturally, and we just let them be the biggest pop stars in the world for half a decade despite knowing that. What were the Monkees but the prior version of that?
Head may not have been a success. Fuck, Head may not even be a film most people like or understand. But it's something I love, and it's something I will continue to love for many years. It's ambitious, it's out there, and it's fully its own thing, and I wouldn't want anything else. In a way, to some, the Monkees will always be that band that stood in the shadow of bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, who innovated and became rock gods. But I think in a glorious moment, they truly pushed boundaries, even if it was sadly rejected by the public. And they should be proud of that. Even if to some, it'll always be incomprehensible. I will forever be proud of how they broke out of that box.
You say we're manufactured, to that we all agree, so make your choice and we'll rejoice in never being free.
wanted to give a special thanks to my $10 a month patrons: Corey Fui Maono, Aerith, Cameron Kanaki, Trent Maudier, Laura M., Felicity, and Paige.